Welcome to this session of the CX Exchange. My guest today is Bob Gibbs, the Associate Administrator for the Mission Support Directorate at NASA. Bob, thanks for taking the time to join us.
Well, thanks for having me.
For the 11th year in a row, and you know this, NASA was the best places to work. NASA was a top finisher. It scored an engagement and satisfaction score of 84.3 out of 100, 10 points higher than the second place agency, HHS. There's a lot to unpack around that. You and I have talked in the past about some of the reasons why, but let's just give folks an understanding. How do you do it? How do you continue to do it? And why is this evolution of really the employee engagement and employee experience so important?
So, great question, good way to start. I will tell you that is the most often asked question that I get when I'm talking with some of our colleagues in the federal sector and some of our friends in the private sector, is how do you continually do that? You know, what do you do? Do you train on these things? Do you specifically focus on these areas? I will tell you, we've never had a meeting saying, how are we going to improve or how are we going to get good scores on our FEVS? I would say there's some very strong cultural foundation that's established at NASA, which is you have leaders that care about their people and people that care about the mission. I think that sounds very simplistic, but it's been built over decades and decades of an incredibly challenging mission with great people giving their all to try and make some incredible things happen, not only for the nation, but for the world. So it's always an interesting conversation. You know, I have a good time when I talk with some of our colleagues or some of our friends, and I say, well, you have to go get astronauts first. And after you get some astronauts, you need to, go to the moon and those sorts of things. It's really not that. It's about listening to your employees. It's about caring what they have to say. And it may sound simplistic, but I think you can go a long ways if you actually listen and you're willing as a leadership team to take action on what you've heard.
It sounds like it's a little bit of a recipe going on here, right? Leaders who care about the people, people who care about the mission, all of a sudden you have success. Do you think about it in that sense, in the way we have a little bit of salt, a little bit of baking powder, a little bit of flour, put some water in there, and then the bread rises? Is it in that vein at all that you're thinking about it? What's the recipe for success?
I'm not sure, to be honest. What I would tell you, I think, from my perspective, it's a thing that you live every day. You demonstrate it through your behaviors and through your actions. You know, we are blessed with a great workforce and incredible people trying to do incredible things, but it's not that we sit there and say, okay, I need to mix this a little bit more and that a little bit more. It's, again, really understanding what are the things that we need to deliver on the mission, right? Mission first, people always is sort of the short tagline that we use. And I think we live that.
One of the things that when it comes to this idea of people, and I heard this just recently, employee engagement equals customer experience, right? Yeah. Better employee engagement, better employee experience. So let's start with that idea of improving the employee experience. You talk about management listening. You're in the mission director, you're associate administrator. I think when we first talked several years ago, you were the chief human capital officer. What is it about? How do you listen to your employees? And then how do you hear them too? Because there's a difference sometimes.
There's a big difference sometimes. I would start with this. I would start with, if you really want to understand how engaged the workforce of NASA is, and does that really change the public perception or the public's interaction, pretty much talk to anyone from NASA. They will talk to you about our mission, about what we're doing. They'll talk to you about the people at the agency, about how our job is to inspire, to help all, right? We are for the benefit of all. Science, exploration, all of these great missions that we do for the benefit of all. But if you talk to anyone in NASA, that comes through. It almost goes back to some of the discussions that JFK had at Rice, where he talked to a janitor and he was telling me he was going to the moon and kind of explained how he saw himself. I would say draw that forward to today. The Artemis architecture, which is being released shortly, really kind of does the same thing. It sets the framework for the agency so that all of the agency and all of our partners, national and international, can see themselves in that equation. When you're talking about listening to employees, it's having an honest conversation. You have to be willing as a leader to say, I don't know. We don't have an answer for that yet, but we are going to work on that, and I'm accountable to you for answering the questions you have asked. So I think there is a big difference to folks talking and being heard. I think there is a very big difference there.
I'm going to tag back to the Artemis architecture, and I know there's only so much you can say about it, but you tag back to the famous John F. Kennedy, President Kennedy's discussion about the janitor, and I've heard the story before about, what do you do? I'm getting us to the moon. Oh, how do you do that, right? So Did you have that, lack of a better word, conscious discussion with the Artemis architecture about how to connect it all? Or is it, again, you start off with culture and the culture just leads you to that path without having that, oh, well, what's the connection? What's the connection? What's the connection?
Yeah, I have a privilege of working for our leadership team, Bill Nelson, Pam Melroy, and Bob Cabana. Not kidding, American heroes, right, and what they have done. And they've been very deliberate about talking about the roadmap for Artemis and those sorts of things. I will tell you, for the employees, when we get through this entire process, it will kind of lay out where we're going and how we're going to get there and the role of everyone in the process. Being able to see yourself in mission is an amazing thing, right? I mean, I think it helps reinforce all the things we've already talked about. The engagement of the workforce, leaders that care about their people, all of those things. I think it's a little inescapable that at NASA we have an incredibly challenging mission. We have technology that's unforgiving. We have science that is on the cutting edge. To do that, we need the best from our entire workforce. The architecture helps bring people into that, but also an environment where people can be themselves, right? They can bring their authentic self to work every single day. We talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, and access, and all of those things. But here's kind of how it lives, Have we established that culture that accepts people for who they are and allows them to contribute their best to this incredible mission?
And I think that the culture piece is so important because scientists, they're not always, the most assimilated people. Is that a fair
They're
word?
interesting. Some of their behaviors are interesting.
Exactly.
I'm going to get beat up for this when I go back to NASA, just so you know.
But it's fair. I mean, not everyone, you can't put a blanket, not every scientist is different or odd. Not every mission director, associate administrator is different or odd, right? We all have our...
Certainly.
But I think understanding the ability to accept that culture is so important. And I think this comes back around to the leadership piece. When you get together with the leadership and you talk about, okay, how do we make sure we communicate with employees, how to make sure, it can't just be let's have an email or let's do another town hall. Are there ways that you communicate with employees that shows that we're listening and hearing?
So I think we do a lot of surveys. That's one way, right? I wouldn't tell you it's the best, but it is a moment in time and it does give you some data. It kind of also can give you some interesting trend data. Really breathing life into our employee resource groups, when all of the administrators, associate administrators, when the front office, when all the leadership of the agency travels, because we do travel quite a bit, very small organization, we spend time with the employee resource groups to hear what they're telling us, hearing from as many perspectives as we possibly can. I think it's beyond argument that a diversity of experience and a diversity of thought leads to a better team that solves hard problems, which is kind of what we do. I think from at least my perspective, and we've got some folks who are absolutely committed to making these things happen for the agency and for the nation.
I had an interesting conversation maybe a month or so ago with the Homeland Security Department folks, and they talked about their employee resource groups too. Yeah. It's a bit of a newer idea probably for them, and not new as in like a year ago, but the last couple of years. Can you just walk me through how many employee resource groups you have, maybe, or give me some of the areas? Is it, for scientists who like to play Dungeons and Dragons? Here we go. I'll get beat up now for that. But
probably.
But you get my point. How are they developed? Is it not just the Johnson Space Center or the Stennis Space Center? Always it's.
Yeah. So I couldn't give you a number because they were changing all the time. So we actually have an employee resource group for people that are remote. Mm-hmm. That's a really different collection of folks who are facing sort of different challenges in their workday. Every center has a group, whether it be veterans or folks of a certain affiliation, or it could be anything, frankly, that they may be able to give the agency, their center, their leadership, us, more perspective on the troubles and the things they're facing. And in talking with our union partners as well, we get invaluable information from them when we're talking about what is the future of work, a term I absolutely hate because we never stopped working. We continue to work today. It's just learning those lessons that we learned during COVID-19 and applying them to get the job done as efficiently and effectively as we possibly can. And
I think sometimes it's also about connecting the employee resource groups with each other.
100%.
Stennis has one, and Johnson has one, and so on and so forth. You have to have the challenges you see at one is probably the challenges you see at the other. Is that part of this traveling around as you go talk to JPL or Ames, you also hear, well, I heard very similar, and then you can, from a headquarters perspective, start to influence some change?
For me, it kind of happens this way. I'll be at Johnson, I'll hear something, I'll go, wow, that probably is something that's going on at every center, and that'll get passed through all of the leadership teams and saying, hey, this is what I heard. Are you seeing something similar? We are having an issue with veteran spouse hiring as an example, talking to one veteran group, and they were talking about how it was very difficult to use spousal hiring authorities. And we were able to kind of work through that problem for all of the centers, not just that singular center. Others were concerned about, some of the environmental conditions in some of our office space and some of the different things. So it's an opportunity, but you learn pretty quickly where you need to have a feedback loop and figure out, okay, is this occurring? How do we bound the problem? What action are we going to take? And then how do we make sure we're accountable to those actions?
The opposite side of this discussion is, okay, how do employees make sure they feel like they have a voice?
Yeah.
Because if they don't feel like they have a voice and, I'm not going to the employee resource group because Bob Gibbs never listens anyways.
Yeah, I've heard that guy's a jerk.
Yeah. He likes to talk a lot.
I've heard these things.
Yeah, that's fine. Yeah. We appreciate that. Is there a way that you also kind of go back to the employees and say, okay, we heard you, and here's the changes we made, and it may take a week, it may take a month, it may take a year to really see it, but we are making change. How do you communicate that back?
This gets into culture and maybe kind of how we do well in FAVS as well. You have to have an environment where it's okay to speak up, where you can dissent, where you can not have the popular opinion, right? You have to make sure it's okay. I will tell you, when we were going through some of our mission support realignment, moving towards an enterprise model, some of the structural things that we did, we were headed down one way, and some of the most junior people in the agency said, boy, that is incredibly stupid. Let me give you an alternative, boss. Let's talk about this. And we end up kind of going down that direction as opposed to the one we were originally heading on. But you have to have an environment where you hear from everyone. And I will tell you, leadership at NASA is really good about hearing from everyone in the room. I think that's incredibly important. I would also add, you have to be okay when you're hearing kind of things you may not want to hear. You got to understand, you work with incredibly smart people, and you may not always have the best answer in the room. So are you honestly committed to the best idea winning, as opposed to what the preconceived notion or what the current plan was? So I think there's some things in there that reinforce the culture, which again, you see the output of it on some of the FEVS. But yeah, it's a challenge.
And I think that culture, when you talk about okay to listen, to kind of push back or to offer an alternative view, is really important when you talk about some of the space work you do and sending satellites and men and women to Mars or to the moon.
Yeah.
If someone can't feel that ability to speak up and go, I don't think that calculation is right, and that's going to push us to the sun or something. If they don't say that, that's
problematic, right?
Yeah, that's huge.
And when you're not involving safety, right, or personnel safety or something like that, making it okay to fail.
Yeah.
If it's okay if you speak up, but if we lop your head off every time you do, then that's probably not the environment where you're going to get the best feedback from your employees. Making it okay to fail. The whole failure is not an option. Well, maybe in some contexts it is, as long as you're learning from it and pushing the process forward.
I think that's a great piece. When it comes to safety of the astronauts and the staff, that's one thing. Yeah. But the enterprise model is a great example.
Yeah.
We thought we'd go in this direction for enterprise procurement or enterprise HR or IT, and someone raised their hand and said, well, if you do that, here's the downstream effect you may not know about. So I think that's a great point. I want to go down, we talked a lot about kind of what you do today, but you have to have a future vision. You always have to say, okay, how can we continue to get better? Are there some initiatives or some ideas that are starting to percolate around, okay, how do we continue to evolve and how we continue to drive better employee engagement?
Yeah, so even beyond the scope of employee engagement, what are we going to be as an agency of the NASA of 2040 is sort of the parlance you hear. Not only are we looking in the immediate future, the next year, the next 2 years, the next 5 years, but what is our role in 2040? As we're looking at the moon to Mars and looking at the Artemis architecture and all of these things, what is the workforce? What is the technology? What is the infrastructure we need to support those missions as the agency goes forward? It's an incredibly challenging task because there is uncertainty, right? The further you go out, there is greater uncertainty. But we believe there's sort of principles. We embed ourselves entirely into the core principles at the agency as sort of an anchoring point. But we have an opportunity to really examine and think, okay, how do we move forward? How are we more flexible, more agile? how do we work better with the private sector or with academia and others? How do we make those things better, easier, faster, kind of a thing? Because I think no matter how you envision 2040, greater partnerships will be part of that solution set.
The Army likes to talk about the Army of 2040.
Yeah.
Have you had conversations with them yet to make sure you're 2040 and they're 2040?
No. We don't want to conflict.
Exactly.
They are armed. We are not.
You have those big rockets, though.
Yeah. Well, we do. We do have large rockets, but no, it's a great opportunity, and it's a great opportunity for our employees to engage and be part of that process.
Right.
Not only are we talking from the administrator's suite on down, we're getting information both ways. And I think that gives you the best product on the other end.
You mentioned the partnerships with academia and private sector, and I think those partnerships also are part of this engagement discussion too.
Yeah.
It's okay to kind of talk to your employees all the time or ensure that they're being listened to and heard, but you also have the same challenges with your partnerships in academia and private sector. Are those processes and those paths very similar, but they have to be a little different too because of the relationship? How do you kind of ensure that you have that culture passes to this other group of partners?
I think the principles are the same, but the discussion, the way you communicate these principles in those conversations are very different. Looking at our infrastructure, trying to find a way to develop this sustainable portfolio and understand how can we support all of the work going on in the academic world and with the commercial space sector as we go forward. We give away our technology on a regular basis. That's just one example. But we also have infrastructure that we share, and we have some great new authorities that the agency can use to leverage our infrastructure for the betterment of all, and which again gets back to one of those core principles.
When you talk about that infrastructure too, it also means international partners. Does the CX effort, if you will, kind of bleed into all these other areas, meaning not just the culture of the employees, but how you treat / work with / feel like there's a partnership, whether again it's Great Britain and UK or Australia, the Five Eyes or whomever?
So I think the Artemis Accords are setting the backbone for sort of the civilian use of space or the peaceful use of space. I think Karen Feldstein, our Office of International Relations, has done a remarkable job of building partnerships internationally so that they can contribute to these incredible missions. It's a never done, it's an always kind of going on sort of line of business, 24/7 they're open, they're doing a lot of work right now. And I think it's incredibly important to the nation that we do these things and project this sort of partnership, this willingness to cooperate and professionally work in space peacefully to the international community. I think that's incredibly important.
When we mentioned kind of the three-legged stool of your outside partners, private sector, academia, and international, are there other customers you look at? Or do you have in terms of your internal strategy of customer experience, internal strategy of employee experience, kind of how does that kind of bleed into other areas? One could say, well, all the citizens also are stakeholders, but it's not quite the same as the agriculture department or even commerce.
The way we interact is a little bit different. We do a ton of work on climate. The amount of data that we put out into the world, and we're trying to make it accessible for everyone out there, is incredibly important. The Office of the STEM Engagement Group run by Mike Kincaid has done some remarkable things about engaging the K through 12, right? Part of our mission, and has been since the 1950s, is inspiring the next group of engineers, scientists, explorers, And I think getting NASA out into the bloodstream and supporting these efforts, it's almost a logarithmic scale of increase of effort and opportunity. And I will tell you, every time I see what they're doing, I walk away. We just had something with Legos, right? We had something with Legos, and then Minecraft, which my son plays, 100 million kids see that, and now they have a Mars option, a moon option now, Mars coming later, I believe, working with our friends who do that Minecraft stuff. So it's a lot of different angles, but the core of it is sort of communicating, inspiring, educating, and I think we're doing pretty good at that.
One of the big pushes I think the Biden administration and agencies have been pushing is tell the story, tell your story better. That's the best way to recruit, retain, and imagine that's something you all have been really good at for the last 60, 70 years, is telling your story and getting people excited. Do you find that your story is harder to tell, or do you find that your story has, well, we haven't been to the moon since 1969.
Well,
so to
why are you
speak.
going back? Kind of a question, right?
Yeah.
I will tell you, I think our comms group, led by Mark Ekon and Johnny Stevenson, are doing remarkable things. They're telling that story any chance they get, every chance they get. And we're changing the way we're looking at it. It would be interesting when we'd have an instrument that would crash after several 10, 20, 23 years of service. And that would be the first paragraph, instead of saying, well, it's only supposed to last 6 months, but we got 23 years of data from it. We have to be better at telling our story. Yeah. But this is what I love, is that you get an opportunity to travel and hear what NASA means to the public. Boy, that really reinforces how important your job is. And maybe we should take another turn on it being a little bit better, because it seems very important to the public.
Because in many ways, your employees are the best recruiters.
100%.
They're the best people who can really help educate folks about what NASA is and what it does. We all may know what it does. We've seen the movies. We've watched the big launches.
Yeah.
But there's so much more. As you said, the climate work is so key. Is that another piece to this employee engagement, getting them to be the ambassadors?
We don't have to get them to be. They are, right?
Yeah.
And one of the most important questions on the FEVS is, would they recommend this as a place to work to their friends? For me, that tells a lot of stories, right? That tells you whether or not they believe in what we're doing. Are we communicating, connecting with them, and do they think it's a good place to work? All of that's kind of wrapped up in that one question. So our best ambassadors absolutely are our employees. And if you get an opportunity, like I said, talk to anyone you happen to see wearing a NASA badge or shirt or whatever, and I guarantee you won't walk away with less information than you walked into the conversation with.
You mentioned data, and you mentioned data as it goes around to climate change, but I'm going to take us in maybe a bit of a different direction, of course, because we're talking about customer experience. How are you using the data, whether it's from FEVS, the Federal Employee Viewpoint Survey, Best Places to Work, or just your own internal surveys, to really drive change?
So I think as we learn things, being able to export that knowledge out into the universe is an incredibly important part of what the agency does. When we talked about some of the Earth Information System data, being able to look at what's the global temperature, what are those sorts of things, what's the water rise, what are all of these things, and being able to use our instruments to help with things like wildfires in California or crops in third world countries. It's all of these opportunities to use this data more effectively. We have to make it accessible to the public, and that's been the big push, right? We have volumes, I couldn't even explain the depth of the data that we have. A vast majority of the data you're going to see on data, climate, and other things come from this agency. We have to do a better job of making it accessible to everybody.
And I know that, again, going back to the White House has really pushed that data accessibility, data sharing. The internal data you collect from your employees, not just the scientific and climate, but hey, from FEVS, here's all our scores. Here's what they told us. OPM, I know, gives you more data than you can probably ever really process. Do you take that every year, and what do you do with it to say, okay, here's where we need to tweak or improve or change? And I know you said it's the culture's really driving a lot of this. But if all of a sudden you see a steep drop in, my boss trusts me to make decisions, as an example, you may want to, why is that? What do you do with that data from FEVS and other areas?
So we run our own survey. We use the OPM instrument, but we administer it in a much quicker time frame so we can get into the data and dig through it. So then there are debriefs on all of the data at the agency level, organizational level, and then down to the unit level. We have a really talented team in the Office of the Chief Human Capital Officer that goes through all this data with the organizations. I will tell you, we are very transparent with it. I post my scores. All of our employees can see our scores from this year, the previous year, and see the direction we're heading. And from that, you have to say, okay, now this has given us a signpost. What else can we look at? Is there unplanned attrition going on here? What do employees say in the FEVS? Are they getting burnt out, which is one of my great concerns, right? We're engaged and on the clock all the time, it seems now. We have to be very careful with that. So there's lots of things that you can then triangulate and say, okay, what else can we learn from this data, putting it with other points of data? Because again, the FEVS is a signpost in time, right? It isn't necessarily, covering the entire period. It's that day when you took the survey. But looking at all these other pieces, I think you can start to really put together a picture and have a conversation with leadership and employees and say, this is kind of what we're thinking. Does this seem to make sense?
Are there certain areas, and I know that the Best Places to Work just came out just in the last month or so, and
we just got a giant plaque for 11th time in a row.
11th time. Your office is full of plaques.
Yep, we have a lot of plaques.
You have a lot, for good reason. But when you look at the data, the most recent data, is there anything that stood out to you? Anything that kind of you would say, oh, that was surprising, or oh, that was unexpected in some way?
The one I'm concerned about, the one I am most concerned about is my workload, right? That's the one where the trend isn't the right direction. Part of that is we're a very small agency, only 1/3 federal employees, 2/3 contractors, and we have a lot going on, right, between Web and Artemis and DART and all the other things that went on during and after the pandemic. So that just drives a lot of effort, a lot of things, requirements on employees. That's the one I'm most concerned about. The one I am always pleasantly surprised by is how much faith they put in their supervisors. So that shows that, at the supervisor to the first report to the employee level, there's a tremendous amount of trust and respect, and that's always something to build on, I think.
I want to talk just real briefly about the one concern, then we're going to also get to the what you're surprised about. Burnout, I think, has been a big issue for a lot of agencies over the years. Is there anything you're doing specifically to start to address that? Because again, 1/3 to 2/3, as you said, feds to contractors, and everyone wants more people, but that's always difficult.
Yeah, right. I mean, I think we have a lot of mission for the money that we're allocated, the resources we're allocated. I would say we're starting to really examine not only what are we asking folks to do, but how are we asking them to do it? Are we engaged in too much collaboration, over collaboration? Are we putting too much on their plates? Are we sure that we're making sure that the truly urgent things get attacked first as opposed to everything being urgent? One of the nice things is the bottom of the email that says, if you get this outside working hours, unless there's some urgent crisis, don't feel the need to respond until you're in normal working hours. I want my folks to shut off their phones, where it's possible. Some jobs that's not possible, right? Every job is situated somewhat differently. But I think having that break from work, because right now we're engaged a lot, I think is an incredibly important thing. We have a great workforce. If you give them the opportunity, they want to be the A student. They want to bring the apple in, right? That's just who they are. And it's a great thing. It also can be a little difficult, on the personal level.
Bob, the burnout piece, as you were just described, is interesting. Is there stuff you're starting to do now that, okay, well, what can we measure if that's a big problem? People say it is, but how do you know it is? And then what can you do about it to reduce that burden or reduce that feeling of burnout?
Yeah, I think there's a lot of opportunity. There's a lot of data out there that you can dig into and really understand. You can look at your unplanned attrition, which is not indicating necessarily that's a problem. You can look at the hours your employees are working or how they're doing what they're doing. We are working with some organizations just starting right now to really understand how we communicate, how do we work together, how do we accomplish the mission. As we're going through this sort of new way of working, really understanding what's required, starting with the what, and then digging into the how. How can we do it? And I would tell you one thing that we have heard from our employees, and I think every agency is hearing that, is employees want more control over their life. So if we can look at a way that we can provide flexibility and accomplish the mission, we should be looking at that. We are a learning agency. So I think there are opportunities there. A lot more to be done in this space. We're just kind of digging into it. But I'm excited for the next 12 months or so.
And that was actually my follow-up is, do you have a timeline of when some of that initial research that will lead to maybe some, lack of a better word, decisions or some initiatives? So
in mission support this year, we have 3 big projects that we're working on. It's workforce, infrastructure, and technology, and how they all come together to accomplish the mission. Because if you look at it, for me, it's, again, it's the stool analogy where you have 3 legs of a stool and they all have to come together to deliver that mission. Again, I'm speaking more on the support than the mission side, which speaks for itself in my mind. So I think we do have an opportunity in the next 12 to 18 months to be delivering on those things and then figuring out how do we integrate across all of these organizational boundaries to make this successful.
Well, I want to go to the other piece of this. You said what always surprises you, how much faith there is in supervisors and the trust. The trust piece is so hard to continue to have. Sometimes bad decisions happen. Sometimes it's on purpose. Sometimes it's by accident. Sometimes there's people who just conflict because of personalities. People are people. We know that. So I think that's really, what are you, around the trust piece, what have you learned from that? And then how do you kind of continue to, you mentioned leadership a couple times during our conversation already, but how do you ensure that that trust is maintained?
I think it's a measure of having respect for your employees. They're not stupid. They know what's going on. Admit when you make a mistake as a leader. Say, you know what, I didn't get that right, but we're going to figure it out and we're going to find the right answer working together. I think being willing and open to have those conversations and secure enough in yourself as a leader to be able to say, boy, not the best answer, but we will figure it out. And being honest with the data, putting the data out there so your folks can see very transparently what you're trying to work on. I will tell you, as I've led transformation at Energy, Navy, and now NASA, it was probably one of the greatest lessons that I learned is that while you may have an organizational imperative for transformation, it occurs on an individual basis. And never forget that, because everyone goes through these things in a very different way, and you have to allow for that. Otherwise, you're inviting a lot more risk to the proposition than perhaps you might want to.
And you came over from NASA, you came over to NASA from Energy,
Yeah.
and you probably had some individual transformation yourself because the whole culture is very different.
It is.
You told us, there's a great story I think you've told before, but I'll ask you to tell it again about when you came over to NASA and that transformation, how you had to transform too.
Yeah, absolutely, 100%. So when I came over to NASA, people were so sincerely concerned and said, hey, welcome to NASA. How are you doing? Is there anything we can do? And it was, the first couple of times was very nice. The next 73 times that it happened, you get a little unnerved, right? You're kind of wondering when's the other shoe going to drop, kind of a conversation. But here's the reality, it was completely sincere. And it was just that first sort of wake up message about how NASA is very different and how the employees care for each other. I'll never forget it. It was, my first month at NASA, and I'll never forget it. It was a wonderful experience now looking back on it.
Did you eventually have to pull someone aside and be like,
more than one person, right?
What's the deal?
I don't completely understand what's going on here. And they're like, no, they mean it. I'm like, sure, yeah. And you keep wondering about it, but the reality was they did mean it.
Somebody wanted like a hiring authority?
A pay raise? Something going on here? I don't know.
Well, you don't control pay raise. I mean,
yeah, our friends on the Hill are
exactly
very nice about that.
We won't touch that. That's the third rail.
Yeah, it's good.
I appreciate the sharing of the story because I think that it goes back to the beginning of our conversation and the culture that is at NASA, and that leads to a better employee experience, which leads again to a better customer experience. The other thing that I think leads down that similar path is the understanding, and you said this earlier about the importance of people are accepting of different people. And I think one of the big surprises or pleasant surprises that that came from the employee viewpoint surveys around diversity, equity, inclusion.
Yeah.
What did you learn from those results and from other, if you will, data points that you've looked at?
I would tell you that every agency needs to work on diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility as if it was a program or project within the agency. We had very high marks in the FEVS for this, but it was because the dedication of our employees, the employee resource groups, and our leadership that takes time out of a rather compressed schedule to hear these conversations, to make sure these employees are felt heard across the agency for a lot of different reasons. And while we are not in the perfect place yet, we continue to work on it. We don't have the answer. We have a lot of answers, and we continue to work on those on a regular basis.
And as you connect those dots around DEI&A and customer experience, it's that idea that different people bring different perspectives, and then that helps you get better at serving employees. Again, what maybe would be, something women in NASA need this type of support. Well, men may do as well, and
Sure.
It helps you think about it in a different way. Is that what's driving some of this?
Yeah, and I think you have to look at sort of these leadership teamings, right? When I was the Chief Human Capital Officer, my deputy was Jane Data, who became our Chico. There are not two people on earth that are more different than Jane and I, right? Jane is classically trained. She's a big theater person. I am neither of those things, right? But our perspectives, our life experiences were so different. We could look at a problem from a variety of perspectives, and we could bring that to the solution space. And I see that all over NASA, right? That's not a one-off example. I see that across the agency, being able to build these teams with a great diversity of experience. And I mean giant D diversity. Prior military, folks that have grown up in very different places, different parts of the world, or whatever it might be. It brings a lot to the solution.
And I know Administrator Nelson recently named 2 new people to lead the diversity effort. One of them is a friend of the station, Steve Shee, who used to be at OPM, who came to NASA. And is that also kind of part of this, again, where this is so important to us, we're going to actually put people in charge of it. I know every agency is supposed to name a chief diversity officer or somebody in that vein, but this is 2 people with 2 very specific jobs that are obviously going to work together.
First, Steve is remarkable, and so is Elaine Ho, who's taken over the ODO world, right? I think they're both remarkable people with great experience, and they're incredibly smart. And if you listen to sort of the diversity plan, which we have published, the agency has published, and we are working towards, it is moving us to a better place. Now, the critics will always say, well, you're looking at your data, your demographics, it hasn't changed as much as you would have liked. Yeah, true. I would agree with that. But I also say I would look at the trend. Look at the women in leadership roles in the agency right now. It's an amazing, amazing trend and streak that's gone on for the last 2 years.
One of the things that I think NASA also is known for, and again, it goes back to the employees are the ambassadors, they're the best, if you will, recruiters. It's how they work within the communities, and I think that's something that also NASA is a big supporter of. Hey, get out in your community, not just talk about NASA, but do things. Can you talk a little bit about that effort and kind of some of the things that maybe have stood out to you over the years?
Yeah, I would tell you that we're seeing right now, we're at a very great point. Mike Kincaid and OSTEM has led an organization that is making those opportunities available and known. Right? We have opportunities where people can pursue passions at work in our talent marketplace from an employment perspective. Now we have an opportunity of engagement with the community where we're going to know about those opportunities and people will be able to see those things and apply to work on those things and get out in the community. And we can do it in a way that the agency understands and has the data of how we're making impact so we can change direction and course as needed.
You also, one of the other pieces around that is you also have gone into the community during times of emergency.
100%.
You've also provided, again, you mentioned the climate change. You mentioned an anecdote about Houston and some of the work you did there. Maybe just offer a little bit of insights there.
Yeah, I'm sure we all remember the floods that happened in Houston a few years back. I will tell you that they hit the NASA family very hard, but we had to maintain working at the center, right? ISS was still flying, right? So we had folks on board, so we had to maintain mission control in some other places. But the NASA community, the NASA family rallied around the folks that were suffering through hard times and the first people providing aid, and it came from every center in the agency to support our family, to support our team members that were in Houston struggling through this. The outpouring was absolutely remarkable. When the administration asked for volunteers post the hurricane in Puerto Rico and everything else from across all the federal agencies, we are by capita the most engaged organization supplying additional help and resources to whatever the administration or whatever is needed internationally. We just have an incredibly diverse set of skills, and we can apply those in a lot of situations.
And it goes back to the culture we talked about earlier, having the culture that people want to be seen, but also heard and also involved. We talked a lot about the positives, and it's easy to talk positives. I'm glad we're doing it. But let's maybe take a half step back and say, where's the biggest areas you see the challenges? You mentioned, obviously, burnout is one. Are there several other areas that you would say, whether it's from FEVs or just from surveys you do internally, or just because you talk to people enough and you go, yeah, that's something we've got to tackle or do better on, where we think we're doing well, but we can do better?
Yeah, I would think, when you look at decision velocity as an agency, we have a great principle of collaboration. I think it gives you a better product. But how do you keep that in balance with making decisions, going out and executing those decisions and making sure those things, are done the right way and we understand exactly what happened as we went through that process? Sometimes I think we get stuck in a more deliberative mode, and I think we could probably do better looking at the decision velocity within the agency.
The question there is, again, is that risk versus reward. Is that the biggest impediment, is the idea that, well, we have to just manage risk better? Or is there something else? Is it too much data? Because we can get, a paralysis by analysis.
I think it's risk, from my perspective. And the agencies, as we deal with risk, especially in, our space flight world or aeronautics, it's a very different calculation of risk. And you go back to Columbia and Challenger and some other things that have happened in the agency's history. So we have to be very careful at how we look at risk. Sometimes, and I think we do this completely unintentionally, we take the risk from a spaceflight program and we put it over business process, where we could actually take more risk, fail fast, move forward, but we try and import sort of the same architecture, the same structure on top of a business process re-engineering sort of a thing. And I don't know if that's always the best answer. There is value in it. I'm just not sure if you're getting an equitable return on that investment.
One of the things around decision velocity, you mentioned business process re-engineering, and then earlier on as well, you mentioned your three kind of mission support priorities. Workforce, we talked a lot about. But I want to talk maybe a little bit of the technology side too. How are you applying some technology to, again, we'll use the term of low value work, high value work, however you want to call it, get folks to improve their decision velocity?
So I would tell you that the Human Capital Office will be standing up more self-help options so folks can get in and do a lot of things that you would need as HR specialist right now. They're working very hard at bringing those to fruition by the end of the year. We've looked at the robotic process automation that happens at our shared service center, which has been in existence for 17 years and is a remarkable organization. They're looking at different routines. I think they have 83 that they've worked through to date, and they're looking to field those out to the centers for a lot of transactional work in finance, grants, human capital, security, and some other areas.
We've talked to your shared service office. It's a great story, and they were so early in the process. I remember talking to them about, do we need to give the robot a PIV card?
Yes, that was an issue, right?
I think OMB finally settled that. It said, well, generally no, but yeah.
It was a real thing, though.
It was, yeah.
That was a real thing.
Yeah, because in some ways they're doing work on the network and they're a persona. We're getting close to the end of the CX Exchange, and I just want to touch on one thing, because we've talked a lot about NASA and all the work you've been doing. How do you share this with other agencies? How do you ensure that the knowledge and the experiences and the success that you've had gets passed around? Because the challenges you have with listening and hearing and culture is not just a NASA challenge. It's a challenge whether, again, at commerce, at agriculture, at interior, or wherever you go.
So it's a great opportunity. I will tell you, no less than 20 times a year, I have the opportunity to work with our colleagues in other federal agencies on a variety of problems, whether it's people, infrastructure, technology, how we're looking at future of work, how we're doing, sort of all of the things that NASA does. The one we already talked about was FEVS and many other things. It's a great opportunity, and I will tell you the common point that I start with every agency is, do you truly understand the problem? Do you have the data? Have you bound the problem so that we can continue to work together and figure these things out? And that's always a great starting point. And it's always, like I said, it's a privilege and an opportunity to help where we can, and we do that regularly.
You mentioned the most common question you usually get is, how? How do you so good for so long? Is there a second most popular question?
Well, that's a good question right there. Yeah. It starts off with usually FEVS and how can we do better and how can we have a more engaged workforce like NASA? And that's really communications. I think Bob Cabana says this and says it very well. Within every problem, there's an element of communications, right? Where you didn't do it right, you didn't do it enough, whatever it might be, that's in every problem. So if you can work on that and communicate to people as if you and I were talking. Don't talk about your high valued culture and this great return on these things that don't mean much to the employee. Have a conversation where they can see themselves in that conversation, that what you're saying to them has value and meaning.
Bob, you've offered so much insights, and I've really enjoyed our conversation. Unfortunately, though, we are out of time for this session of the CX Exchange. So first, let me thank my guest. Bob Gibbs is the Associate Administrator for the Mission Support Directorate at NASA. Bob, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jason. It's a great time.
I'm Jason Miller, and you've been listening to Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more from the CX Exchange.